And good day, everyone. On behalf of the Bureau of Justice Assistance, let me welcome you to the Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance webinar on the evidentiary value of body-worn camera footage. My name is Chip Coldren. I'm the Managing Director for Justice Programs at the CNA Institute for Public Research, the Director of Technical Assistance for the Bureau of Justice Assistance's Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance Program, and I will begin the introduction for today's webinar. Today's webinar focuses on an emerging issue in the world of body-worn cameras, that of how body-worn cameras are affecting prosecutors and public defenders. This is a topic we do not know a lot about, partially because we suspect that body-worn camera footage does not come into play much, relatively speaking, the further a case goes into the judicial process. So for today's webinar, we'll look into some early interesting research on this very topic. We also think that we're becoming more aware of their value in collecting good evidence. So our view of them is expanding the more experience we get. We certainly think this is an issue worth looking into, hence today's webinar topic. Today's webinar will cover such issues as the experiences and opinions of prosecutors and defense counsel regarding body-worn camera usage, concerns they have about processing and using body-worn camera footage, and types of cases for which body-worn camera footage is most useful. The individuals we will hear from today include Dr. Craig Uchida, President of Justice and Security Strategies and a key partner with CNA and Arizona State University in the delivery of technical assistance under this program. Dr. Nick Robertson of the Rochester Institute of Technology. He is currently working on the impact of body-worn video on the work of local prosecutors and public defenders. Dr. John McCluskey, also from RIT. In addition to his work on this topic, his most recent work includes research on police decision-making, emerging technology, and its impact on criminal justice. Damon Mosler, Deputy District Attorney in San Diego County and a lead technical assistance provider with our program, and Jennifer Hyatt, a prosecutor from the Monroe County, New York District Attorney's Office. She's been a prosecutor there for about 11 years and currently handles narcotics and firearms cases. Thanks to all of them for sharing their time and experiences with us and for working with us on putting this webinar together. This is one in a series of webinars sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and coordinated by CNA for the Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance Program. We thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance for its investment in the Body-Worn Camera Grant Program, in the Body-Worn Camera Toolkit, and in a range of technical assistance resources and opportunities for agencies implementing body-worn cameras. The Bureau supports state, county, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies in many, many ways, and we are grateful that they do. Please permit me just a few other comments. This webinar is recorded for the benefit of others who may view it later on our website. If you are not speaking, please mute your telephone to avoid any unwanted background noise, and thank you for that. There will be opportunities for questions and participation during the webinar, so please make your thoughts and questions known. I can assure you that others will appreciate hearing what you have to say. If you don't get a chance to voice your comments or questions, please use the chat utility and we'll do our best to respond to your input. Following the webinar, you will receive a request to evaluate it. Please complete this evaluation and please give us your honest thoughts and recommendations. And please also let us know what other topics you think we should cover on future webinars. Now let me also thank Samantha Reinerson, Denise Rodriguez, and Elliot Harkavy at CNA who do the background work to make sure these webinars go smoothly. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Craig Uchida to get us started. Craig?
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Craig Uchida, and I'll be your host and facilitator for this webinar today. We're trying to do some different things, so rather than strictly rely on PowerPoint slides, we're going to try to facilitate a discussion with our panel. As you've heard, we've got John McCluskey and Nick Robertson from RIT, and we have two prosecutors, one from Monroe County, That's Jennifer Hyatt, and we have Damon Mosler from San Diego. You'll be hearing from them shortly, but let me first provide the structure and somewhat of an overview of how this is going to work. You'll hear about public defender and prosecutor perceptions based on our research, and you'll also hear commentary from our prosecutors about certain findings. We'll be talking about discussion points, specific ones, and we're also going to be talking briefly about future directions of all of this. There are 4 primary discussion points that we'll raise, and for each of these points, we'll present a slide that shows findings from the research that was conducted, and then I will turn to our prosecutors who will discuss their perspectives. So we'll first talk about resources and training issues that affect prosecutor offices and public defenders. We'll talk about the timeliness of obtaining body-worn camera footage by those officers. We'll then explore the notion of what's the impact of body-worn cameras on juries. What are jurors thinking in terms of body-worn camera footage? And then finally, we'll look at the effects of body-worn camera footage on specific cases, particularly domestic violence and other types. Before we turn to the actual findings, however, I want to give John McCluskey a chance to give an overview of the research and the methods that were conducted over the last year. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks everyone for attending today. We launched the research project to explore whether and how body-worn cameras influenced work among public defenders and prosecutors and what sense they had regarding the value of body-worn camera footage in terms of evidence, and to explore convergent and divergent concerns they might have had across public defenders and ADAs. The selection of the 3 sites we chose was based on geographic representation and a range of county sizes. So we have Monroe County, which has about 750,000 people. It's a top 100 county in the United States. Travis County is a top 50 county with about 1.2 million, and San Diego is in the top 5 with about 3 million folks. And so the other aspect of this that was important to us was thinking about the access that we could get from the different attorneys' offices. And so we thank the 5 sites that we were able to access there, where public defenders, chief public defenders, and the district attorneys allowed us to come in and take their time and get some input and cooperation to do this research. We chose North San Diego out of the San Diego County as a satellite office that has 57 prosecutors. So you can see that San Diego, in the second row of the table, has about 310 prosecutors. So we focused on that office, which is centered on the city of Escondido, where body-worn cameras were adopted in 2014. Travis County centered on Austin. It had 95 ADAs, and body-worn cameras were adopted in Austin in 2017. And working backwards towards the left, Monroe County is centered on the city of Rochester, has between 70 and 80 ADAs, and body-worn cameras were adopted there in 2016. And another useful variation across these is that the way body-worn camera platforms delivered videos to prosecutors showed variation in terms of North San Diego County having several different methods of cloud-based delivery, Austin having a unitary cloud-based solution, and Rochester having a Blu-ray disc delivered to prosecutors. 2 public defender offices were also involved in the research. We'd note, just for these purposes, that Travis County did not have a dedicated public defender's office except for a small subset of cases. So we were unable to systematically survey or interview contract defense attorneys at that site.
John, can you tell us a little bit more about the actual surveys that were done? And maybe Nick can talk about the interviews that he conducted. So John, you want to talk about the surveys?
Sure. For the research, we first developed a pair of survey instruments to primarily capture patterns of BWC implementation and use, which was centered on the perceptions of evidentiary value, as well as obstacles and concerns facing public defenders and prosecutors. To administer the survey, we used a Qualtrics online platform and obtained email addresses from attorneys across all 5 offices. We estimate completing it required probably 20 minutes, and we sent out about a total of 217 surveys to prosecutors and received 116 complete. A few more have some partial responses, but these numbers are for those surveys that were nearly or fully complete surveys. So that turns out to be about a 54% response rate among the prosecutors. We sent out 107 public defender surveys, and we had 44 near or fully complete surveys, and that's a response rate of about 41% among the public defenders. So in total, we have 160 attorneys who completed surveys, and on the slide you're looking at, you can see in the bottom two rows, there are 33 completers from the Monroe County Public Defender's Office, 11 completers in San Diego's North County PD Office, and 59 ADAs in Monroe County, and so on.
Okay, good, thanks. Nick, do you want to talk a little bit about the surveys, or the interviews, rather?
The qualitative data for the study are from 51 interviews of prosecutors and defense attorneys at the 3 research sites. We interviewed 10 prosecutors at the Monroe County District Attorney Office and 9 attorneys at the Monroe County Public Defender Office. In San Diego County, California, we interviewed 14 prosecutors from the North County Office and 7 public defenders. And in Travis County, Texas, we interviewed 11 prosecutors from the District Attorney's Office and the County Attorney's Office. The interviews were conducted in person and lasted roughly an hour. There is no public defender office in Travis County, and so we did not interview any public defenders there. After the interviews were transcribed, they were then analyzed for themes.
So we're going to go to our first slide here that gives findings. And let me just say that John will talk about the findings on the surveys, and then what we'll do is I'll ask Jennifer and Damon to give us their perspectives on what's going on in each of their counties. So John, you want to talk about this slide?
The charts on this slide are drawn from the surveys administered across the offices. We divided the responses into groups by public defender and ADA, as you can see in the bottom axis, identifying those groups. Blue on the left-hand side of the pairings indicates disagreement, and orange indicates agreement with the statement. And for purposes of the presentation, we collapsed agree and strongly agree into one category, and disagree and strongly disagree into the second category. And there's two questions captured here. And the first is about video technology, and asks, resources are needed for better video technology within your office. And here you can see a convergence on this question. 72% and 83% of the PDs and ADAs, respectively, agree with this question, indicating that technology in their offices is in need of some improvement. On the right-hand side, the pairing of ADA and PD responses, we have a second question, and we can see a divergence here. This question asks, specific training is needed in order to handle body camera evidence. Here you can see nearly 3/4 of public defenders agree or strongly agree that evidence training is needed, while ADAs in the sample were about evenly split on this issue. The contrast here is significant, suggesting that the PDs see a greater need than their counterparts that responded from the 3 ADA offices. And as Craig mentioned, these findings are the context for the discussion among Jennifer and Damon.
Okay, so Jennifer, I'm going to turn to you first. If you can talk a bit about your resource issues and perhaps about some training needs as well. So go ahead, Jennifer.
Department for our office. Right now we have 2 employees, and what happens when there's a case with body-worn cameras, the attorney is assigned a case. We fill out a form that gets sent to those 2 individuals. We wait for one of them to burn us either a DVD or a Blu-ray disc, depending on how much footage there is on a particular case. We, as attorneys, do not have direct access to the servers housed by the various police departments that have body-worn camera programs. Some of the smaller agencies here in Monroe County outside of the Rochester Police Department, we actually have to send somebody to their office or have somebody come to ours to deliver a physical disc. Once that disc is provided to me, the good thing is that those discs, or the video files, are in MP4 format, so they can easily be opened on any computer with Windows Media Player. I then need to review the files for any possible redactions prior to it being turned over, and that can take anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours of my time, depending on how many videos there are. If I need to have anything redacted, I then have to put in a request to our IT department and ask them to redact the video because I do not have the software necessary to do it on my computer. And I also cannot provide those files to defense attorneys via email or any other system, as we don't have any sort of file sharing program set up, and our email system won't allow us to send those video files as they are too big. In regards to training, prior to body-worn cameras being deployed amongst the Rochester Police Department, all of the attorneys in the district attorney's office were trained on how the system was going to function, when cameras needed to be activated, and how we were going to request footage. But the defense bar and the public defender's office were not really given any of that information, so they've had to sort of learn it on the fly as we go.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. So Damon, how's your experience been in San Diego? I know there's some differences. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Craig. For the most part, since we first started getting cameras in 2014, we have had access to the videos on a cloud platform. And though one of our major departments for a while delivered discs, now virtually every department that has cameras is making the videos available to us on the cloud platform. And for the most part, they're doing it at the point that cases are submitted to us. So our prosecutors have access, if they choose to view for an issuing decision prior to making that decision on the videos. For the ones that are a little slower in delivering videos, we do require certain cases have videos supplied to us prior to making a charging decision, but not all of their videos. And those involve domestic violence and the use of force by law enforcement. But because we receive, on average, 85,000 hours of video a year, we do not view all the videos prior to making a charging decision, just in those certain cases. Our DAs have the ability to do their own redaction on that platform, and some of them do that at the early stages for discovery. Others use our technical support division for purposes of creating videos for trial. And in looking at what we did and how we handle the training, we've conducted several office-wide trainings on the use of videos. One was for access, one was for redaction, and the other was how to handle discovery. In turn, we also went to the public defender's offices, all 4 locations that we have in San Diego, and spent time with them, not necessarily training them, but to educate them as to what the technology was and to get their input from them as to how they could get the technology. And we have been successful in having them receive it electronically as well, which has helped limit the additional resources we might have originally thought we would need to process all these videos. And we did the same for the courts, so that way we didn't have to jump through as many hoops when we first started introducing this evidence in court. By demystifying it to the judges as well as the defense bar, it has made the adoption a little bit easier across the county, and we've been fortunate for that reason.
So our next item and findings deal with the timeliness of obtaining video footage, and also the timing of officers activating their cameras. So, John, I'm going to turn back to you about this chart. Go ahead.
So just to reiterate, the graph we've collapsed somewhat and none into a contrast category of orange, and we compare that with folks who responded with high concern, shaded in blue, for ease of presentation. So the contrast between public defenders and prosecutors are, in both these cases, statistically significant. So the first question is timeliness of obtaining video footage. Here, 64% of public defenders responded to the survey and said they were highly concerned about this, compared to 42% of the ADAs. And then the second question on the right-hand side is the timing of officers turning cameras on and off. And if you look at this chart, you can see regarding activation, 98% of public defenders reported high concern with the timing of activation of cameras compared to their 40% of their ADA counterparts having that level of concern. So we have here a strong indication that concerns of the public defenders and ADAs diverge substantially here, and this serves to provoke a next discussion between Jennifer and Damon.
So Damon, I'm going to ask you to speak and talk about this first, about timeliness and activation. So go ahead.
Yes, thank you. With respect to the timeliness and how we get the videos to them, this has been a big issue for our public defenders. And in fact, when we first started processing the videotapes, our initial policy was to review the videos prior to providing it in discovery and create redactions where necessary. This delayed some cases and it delayed the receipt of videos by our public defenders who handle a vast majority of our cases. And they came to us and asked us to reconsider how we delivered the videos so they could get them faster and have more opportunity to review themselves and to communicate with their clients with respect to the videos. And so as a result of that, we adopted a system where we have protective orders that we get signed at arraignment by the public defender, ourselves, and the court, each one keeping a copy of it. And that affords us the ability to get the public defender's videos faster in our general crimes cases. Those cases where they have the protective order, they agree they will not provide a copy to their client and will not show them anything that involved personal identifying information. Some of our cases in our specialized units do not get delivered this way because it does require eyes on the video prior to discovering it, and those involve gangs and certain sex crimes or child abuse cases. But otherwise, for a vast majority, because the public defender wanted the cases earlier, we changed from the mandatory viewing, which was probably untenable with as many hours of video that we get, to doing it this way with the protective order. With respect to the activation, the public defender actually raised an issue with us that we had not understood or were even that aware of, and that is that one of our major police agencies was not recording all the victim statements in a domestic violence case because their policy said not to, because they felt there was a privacy concern voiced by some group to them. They misinterpreted it and had that policy. It was at the request of the public defender that the police department reviewed that policy and made changes that were completely appropriate. I think all prosecutors would agree that we would want those statements, but it was our public defender's office that helped us understand that and move forward because they wanted more evidence out there, in essence, to help them explain things to their client and hopefully adjudicate the case correctly.
So Jennifer, I know there's been changes in your discovery rules. Do you want to talk about that and also the activation issue as well?
Absolutely. Obviously, each state has its own laws when it comes to discovery, and each jurisdiction has its own policy as to whether they will go over and above that. Currently, our office has an open file discovery policy, which goes beyond what New York currently requires when it comes to pretrial discovery. We currently provide that body-worn camera footage to defense counsel at arraignment on an indictment or shortly thereafter. An indictment arraignment can occur anywhere from 2 weeks to several months after the date of the arrest. That rule is changing on January 1st. And going forward in New York State, all discoverable material, including grand jury transcripts, lab reports, etc., including body-worn camera, must be provided to the defense within 15 days of arrest. So there's a little bit of concern on our end for the staffing levels necessary to get those steps taken care of within those first 15 days, especially on cases where we need to review the video to make sure there's nothing that needs to be redacted. Sometimes our IT people are testifying in a trial, or they're out of the office gathering video, or they're in training. We may need to move towards some sort of a protective order policy that's like the one currently used out in San Diego, but we would need to explore how that would work with our judges and our defense bar. When it comes to activation, obviously there's been some learning curve for officers who are on the job prior to the institution of the body-worn cameras. One of the issues that we had here in Rochester was that the first cameras that the officers were issued would often fall off when the officer ran, or knocked off when they reached across their body to utilize the radio, and that was because of the points of contact on the uniform, is how it was explained to me. Our newer cameras now have 4 points of contact on every corner, so we have many fewer instances of a camera actually getting dislodged. One limitation is there's still a limited field of view. If the camera is activated when the officer is behind the wheel of the vehicle, you get a great shot of the steering wheel, but you don't see what they see out of the window, and our police officers don't have dash cameras to fill in that gap between their verbal testimony and the camera footage that is captured.
Okay, thank you. I've got a quick question here for Damon. Can you provide the group with a sample of that protective order, Damon? Can we make that available for people?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So we'll indicate where you can get that as well at the end of this. So I'm going to move on. Our next finding deals with decision-making by juries and the perceptions of prosecutors and public defenders on jury decision-making. So, John, I'm going to turn it over to you to explain this slide.
The final area that we want to explore is going to merge with Nick's discussion of the qualitative data that we collected in face-to-face interviews. But here on this slide, again, we have a question indicating across the survey respondents a divergence between public defenders and ADAs. Here we assign the color blue to public defender responses by each category and the color orange to ADA responses by each category. The question here focuses on juror skepticism, that is, specifically, jurors questioning key testimony when video footage is not available. Responses are arrayed across high, somewhat, and not at all concerned categories. And this chart shows a comparatively elevated level of concern among the ADAs in the sample. Interesting, only 2 are not at all concerned. In comparison, about 23% of the public defenders were not concerned with jurors questioning key testimony, perhaps suggesting that that skepticism would benefit defense. This contrast in the survey data is interesting because in our in-person interviews, we did find, since we could probe and ask follow-up questions, a little more consistency regarding public defenders and ADA responses regarding how decisions by jurors would be made in light of BWC. And I'll turn over to Nick to lead the discussion on that area.
Existing research indicates that prosecutors and defense attorneys very often reference the jury in their decision-making and overall case strategy. The vast majority of cases are plea bargained. However, in this process of plea bargaining, prosecutors and public defenders often reference how they perceive jurors will vote if the case goes to trial, given the facts of a particular case. In our research, we subsequently sought to ascertain prosecutor and public defender perceptions of the impact of BWC on the jury decision-making that was occurring in their jurisdiction, in addition to their anticipated impact of BWC. As I stated before, we conducted a total of 51 interviews with attorneys, 35 ADAs, and 16 PDs, and the interviews were transcribed and analyzed for themes. One of the major themes we found among the prosecutors and public defenders is what is referred to as the CSI effect. This CSI effect is a function of various TV crime shows that often include fictionalized accounts of crime scene investigations, which lead many potential jurors to expect what they see on TV in the actual criminal justice system. According to the prosecutors and public defenders, jurors expect body-worn cameras to be available primarily due to media exposure via TV dramas and news regarding BWC footage. Interestingly, a few of the attorneys offer that even when BWC footage is not available, jurors are asking if there is any type of other video available, such as cell phone or video surveillance. One public defender relayed to me that jurors are aware of the widespread availability of cell phones with cameras and that there are even cameras on the public buses. So even when an incident is not caught by an officer's BWC, jurors expect video surveillance from other sources. Another important theme that arose among the prosecutors and public defenders was that in their tend to be suspicious when BWC footage is missing when they think it should be available. So, for example, jurors are suspicious when police officers report, for example, that the body-worn camera fell off while they were running after or detaining a suspect. Both prosecutors and PDs perceive that jurors prefer body-worn camera footage over officer testimony. Jurors, they claim, are suspect of police testimony also when body-worn camera footage is not available when it should be, and even in cases where the jurisdiction has not even adopted body-worn camera, jurors are suspicious as to why they haven't. A quote here is a good example of the kind of ideas that were presented by the prosecutors and public defenders. This is from an ADA. I think that because of the media portrayal of BWC, jurors expect everything now to be on camera. I just did a resist and arrest. They, the local police department, didn't have body-worn cameras yet. My jurors did not like that at all, and because the officers had to get physical with the defendant, they just assumed it was basically the officers beating up the defendant. But that wasn't the case, but it wasn't on camera. And I'll turn back to Craig Uchida.
So I'm going to start with Jennifer on this one with respect to juror decision-making in Monroe County. So Jennifer, please go ahead.
Thank you. Obviously, as any prosecutor does, we've been spending time addressing the CSI effect for years when it comes to fingerprints, DNA, and now body-worn camera, its existence, its limitations, or its non-existence is another thing that we have to add to address to the jury during selection in the very limited time that we have with them. One of the ways that we found to combat the limitations of the body-worn camera footage is to find ways to utilize what footage we do have, even if it doesn't capture the crime itself, such as finding still images. Often, still images from that body-worn camera will capture things that the technician's photos taken later on do not, such as a defendant's clothing or exactly where somebody was standing at a particular moment in time. The benefit to those still images is they can go with the jury into the jury room for their deliberation, unlike the video itself, where they would need to come back out into the courtroom and request to have that replayed. We can also use that to show the layout of a house or what the crime scene looked like when officers first arrived. And oftentimes, most beneficial is showing the tone of voice and the actions of those police officers and whether they were acting reasonably and appropriately with a defendant or a suspect or anyone else on scene at the time that they arrived to that report.
Great, thank you. So Damon, what's your perspective on this in San Diego?
A lot of what we've encountered is similar to what Jennifer and prosecutors across the country have encountered. The juries definitely want to see some video. We try to find a way to put video in on every case if we can, whether it be just the victim initial report or a picture of the defendant or the defendant themselves if it's applicable. And that's something that all of our prosecutors are trying to do because the jury does want that. And when the video doesn't depict the aha moment, which most of them will not, we spend a lot of time with the officer on direct examination, having them explain the nature of policing and why things are or not on the video, and that requires some preparation time with the officer ahead of time if the officer is able to carry the day for that. And that helps us break down some of the jury's reluctance to accept the officer's testimony alone and not the video. So wherever possible, we use the video to corroborate the officer and try to make the officer look like they're doing their job the correct way, which is usually the case anyway.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the last category of discussion is on the influence of body-worn cameras on specific types of cases. And so we're first going to look at domestic violence, and then we'll talk about other cases as well. I'm going to turn to Nick to talk about his findings from his interviews. And go ahead, Nick.
As Craig just stated, I'll speak specifically on the influence of body-worn camera on domestic violence cases. In the interviews with the prosecutors, we asked them questions regarding the types of cases where body-worn camera footage was particularly influential in their case strategy and decision-making. One of the types of cases they mentioned is domestic violence cases. Prosecutors indicated that victims and witnesses often recant in domestic violence cases. However, if the officer or the officer show up to the scene and get a statement from a victim or a witness who is visibly upset, crying, or potentially has bruises, then that can be used in the plea bargaining process with the defendant's lawyer. Additionally, prosecutors perceive that BWC footage in domestic violence cases helps to bolster and add credibility to the testimony of police officers. The following two quotes from prosecutors are illustrative of the aforementioned theme. For example, we go into it not necessarily expecting every time that the victim might recant, but knowing that it's possible, and if we have their statement in the scene at the moment of exactly what happened, it can be useful for us. Another example of a statement from a prosecutor in support of this theme is, it protects the officers a lot from having their credibility challenged because we just play the video. So to summarize, we find that BWC is particularly helpful in domestic violence cases where victims and witnesses recant and offering credibility to officer testimony, and in plea bargaining with defense attorneys.
So I'm going to turn to Damon on this one in terms of domestic violence in particular, and then I'll turn to Jennifer on other types of cases. So Damon, please, go ahead.
Well, I think we can tell from our initial public defender's office request for having law enforcement tape the domestic violence victims that everybody in the system finds that to be helpful, that there's no chance of a victim recanting, and it actually allows the perpetrator to understand what really occurred that they may not be able to hear from their attorney, but they're hearing it from the victim at the time. And most of those cases, if the videotape supports it, they're going to resolve, because a lot of times it involves counseling, which is very helpful. So overall, the videotapes are helpful in not only charging decisions, but in case resolution. And then for prosecutors, it's been very helpful when our victims become reluctant to be able to show the true demeanor and what occurred. And over time, we're seeing officers do a better job of asking sympathetic questions at the front end for us to understand even more why the person called on that particular day. Anything else that may have occurred can be talked about then, and that's helpful for us to assess the case, but also to make sure we get the right resolution on the case.
So, Jennifer, what other cases have you had to deal with that body-worn cameras have had some type of effect or could be useful too?
Well, oftentimes the cases that I'm working on involve either calls by a civilian for shots fired, or perhaps there's a stop of police officers on a vehicle where the defendant ends up being a passenger as opposed to the driver. I've been able to utilize that body-worn camera to make sure that the driver, who is uncharged for whatever reason, can't now change their story and come in and claim ownership or possession of the illicit items. And also, there's a civilian making a report, perhaps they were menaced by a gun or they were the victim of a shots fired. That body-worn camera captures their body language, their emotion, their exact verbiage at the time of the initial report, as opposed to perhaps a calm demeanor that they display on the witness stand at trial in front of a jury 6, 9, 12 months later, which has been very helpful in order to make sure that they remember exactly what happened and to portray to the jury exactly what that experience was for that civilian.
Okay, so we're going to talk briefly about future directions for evidence management and evidentiary value, rather. And I'm going to talk first about technology and talk about digital evidence management. And I know that some folks in our audience are part of a digital evidence team, and I want to address some issues in that arena. What we're talking about here basically is that digital evidence management incorporates and encompasses a large number of different devices, technologies, and data. And what we're going to do over the next year is specifically look at how we manage body-worn camera footage. So as you've heard today, obviously there's a lot of information. There's a lot of data and photos and footage, et cetera, that the police and the prosecutors and even the courts are starting to deal with. And we're still a bit in our infancy in looking at digital evidence management, and so that's the point. The point of what we want to do and will be doing under the body-worn camera training and TA contract is to look at different processes that are currently going on within law enforcement agencies, and not just police departments, but as you've heard today, from within prosecutorial offices and from within public defender offices. So how are more and different things happening across the country? How are prosecutors collecting, storing, retrieving, and disseminating the camera footage appropriately? You heard today about having to cut DVDs or Blu-rays and having cloud storage where you can retrieve it. So what are the variations across the country on that? So we'll be looking at that. And it applies not only to police internally looking at how they have their processes, but I think it's extremely important to look at prosecutors, public defenders, and the courts in terms of their processes. What are they doing? What can we do to help them with that? The other notion in technology that we heard a lot about and had questions about deal with redaction, especially resources and routines and types of software that are out there that are useful or not. And again, what are the processes that both police and prosecutors go through in redacting video footage? And again, that's internal. It could be that the police are concerned about redacting images of undercover officers. It may be that, and then they still have to release the video to the public. And you've heard already about how perhaps victims and others, their images need to be redacted in different offices. So we're going to be looking at that, and also the routine that goes on with respect to redaction and what it takes. So that's coming. That's part of the project we're involved in over the next year. And in between, we hope to be able to have reports for practitioners. I'm sure we'll have another webinar on this topic, and information will be available on the BWC training and TA website as well. For case management, I'm going to turn to Damon, and Damon can talk about what he sees as issues in the future for case management. Go ahead, Damon.
I look at the allocation of resources by law enforcement towards these video cameras and the storage as a unique opportunity for law enforcement to work with their prosecutors to figure out how to best store all of this evidence, not just the body camera evidence, but citizen videos, surveillance videos, and all the other digital evidence that occurs, plus the written reports in one central place that allows the practitioners in the criminal justice system to have the appropriate access to the appropriate files digitally and on demand as they need to. So you're looking at digital evidence management from a regional standpoint. It may not happen overnight, but if all this money is being invested at this point in time, it would make sense that we have that conversation and dialogue, and that is occurring with certain prosecutors' offices where they're coming to law enforcement and talking about, in a regional area, what can we do to avoid unnecessary duplicate storage across county systems and government systems. And it gives us a chance to begin that dialogue, and we should at the point that we're spending all of this money. There's one county in Texas that's coming very close, and another one in California where the DA's office is taking the lead, but it also can be a law enforcement lead to have that dialogue and get people within the region to talk about how we can do that. You may not have all the same camera, but the technology exists to keep all those videos in one central place, and this is the time to be able to do that.
Great, thank you. John, what are the future directions in research that you're seeing?
Okay. Broadly speaking, I think the thing that Nick and I learned the most about the utility of the research community is really trying to serve practitioners as collaborators. And by that, I think convening public defenders and ADAs and asking questions about their experiences with BWC and what questions they need to have addressed going forward is probably the best broad starting point for this, suggesting areas where they believe issues are ripe and in need of investigation. Overall, it's clear that that the technology is changing, camera resolution is increasing, and the research that we did just last summer in some ways is almost a history project. So I think nimble research is what's called for here, that we have to try to be timely about doing that, and that's in the broadest sense. In the specific sense, I think focusing on types of cases makes a lot of sense, and I think I want to say focusing on domestic violence and understanding whether and how BWC affects processing from the initial 911 call to police response, arrest, charge, and so on is kind of a holistic focus, I think that would be fruitful given the conversation that we've had here, and trying to understand how the prosecutor's office has been able to give feedback in terms of policy into the public defender's office, the police department, in terms of their policies for how they go about recording domestic violence cases, and then ultimately what that does to the way those cases are processed. I think that's a really important and specific question to address. So in summary, I think there's sort of the broad approach of how can we be helpful, and the second is, from our conversation here, it would seem like domestic violence is a place to focus research in a specific way.
Okay, so I'm going to turn this over back to Chip. Chip, I know we have some questions, and if you or Denise, want to raise those? Perhaps we can answer them.
Hi, Craig. We did have a few questions come in the registration. So the first one is, are there any testimonials from public defense offices that you can share?
I'm going to turn that to Damon and or Nick about the offices of public defenders. Did you hear any positives about body-worn camera footage, and in what way? Nick, why don't you go first?
That it made it much easier to deal with a number of their cases in terms of resolving these cases, because from their perspective in dealing with their clients, for example, they could, if they had access to the video, could show it to their client and say, I think you should take this plea, or this is the strategy moving forward based on what we've seen in the footage. If the client told them something that is not corroborated by the footage, it's very helpful in that sense in terms of going forward with their cases. It's also helpful also in their dealings with prosecutors, right? Based on what they see, based on the facts they see in the body-worn camera, that influences how they negotiate with the prosecutors.
Good. Damon or Jennifer? Damon first.
I would echo that in my conversations with our local public defender and with defense attorneys in other parts of the country. Anything they can get that helps them either attack the officer they're happy with, but also if it helps them convince their client to accept a plea bargain or to resolve the case, they're happy with. They don't really have anything negative to say about that, because usually it will help them one way or the other with helping their client out.
Jennifer, do you want to add anything?
I agree with everything that Damon said, but it's also been very helpful for me in terms of making charging decisions as to whether I should indict a case or make a misdemeanor offer, coupled with especially newer officers. If something happened and I need to explain why I can't go forward with a case, it's been helpful in terms of training and furthering discussions beyond simply what they've written in their report. I can see firsthand exactly how things went down.
Sam, we have another one or two?
We have two more questions that essentially deal with resource issues. So just let me go through them one by one, and I think anybody can jump in if they want to. So the first one goes like this. The cost of digital storage has gone down since computers were invented. The quality of video capture is increasing, and with it, the size of video files. So can we make any predictions about the future cost of preserving video files? Maybe I'll hand this off to Damon to get us started on that one, because I know he's dealt with these issues.
Thank you, Chip. I have dealt with the issues, but I've not gone on the actual cost level. I have heard from law enforcement that it is costing less, and they're increasing their actual resolution of the videos, but I don't know the actual numbers, given that that's more of a business model on the vendor side, so I'm not able to finish the answer for you.
Yeah, sure. Craig, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I'd say, too, that it depends in part on the way in which video is being preserved or saved. In terms of storage, you need to consider things like whether you're doing it on premises and in your own servers, because, yes, then that storage may increase because of the amount of video that you're accumulating over time. And same thing with the cloud, although the cloud is generally less expensive and you can store more in them. I don't want to predict the future costs, but yes, I agree. I think it is going down. It should be going down. I would also consider, though, your policies, police department policies about storage and the amount of time that you store the video, because that certainly does play a part, and what kinds of video you're actually storing. Are you storing everything? Is it or is it just the misdemeanors, felony arrests, things like that, or critical cases? So a lot of this deals with policy as well. So those are things to consider when you're looking at the cost down the road of video storage. How about you,
Okay,
Chip? Can I throw it back to you?
Yeah, you can. I just got a note from our technical expert, Elliot Harkavy, who suggests that the trend in the industry is to flat rate storage. If that continues, that storage cost will probably remain relatively constant compared to other costs of body-worn camera programs. So that's an interesting piece of information. Okay. One other question here, and I'm not sure if this question comes from a prosecutor's office or public defenders, but it's 5 years ago we were a one-man unit. Now we've grown to 6 and preparing to hire at least one more. Is this a trend that you see in other departments and regions? So maybe I'll start with Jennifer here and just see, has all of this impacted the size of your unit, Jennifer?
Well, we had one individual hired on to work in that IT capacity just for other surveillance videos and such before the body-worn camera program went live, and it was very clear very quickly that he needed another person. I think all of us would hope that we'd get a third, but as is typical for most governmental agencies, finding the funding for that has been difficult. Do we want an additional IT person or do we want an additional attorney? Unfortunately, sometimes those are the choices that have to be made. So with limited resources, I'm not really sure what the answer is.
Yeah, I understand that. Damon, you want to chime in here?
You know, I actually had that conversation with one of our executives today, and we find that though increased technology has allowed increased efficiencies, we find that other things are taking up more time and not really changing staffing. So not increasing but not shrinking like we predicted, with other things occurring in terms of digital cases and things like that, because something like videos is taking more time than the paper cases that we don't have to process and data input anymore.
Thank you both very much. Craig, I'm going to move into some concluding remarks and questions, if that's all right.
Sure. No, that's fine. Please, go ahead.
If there's anyone of our participants that wants to ask a question right now that has not been raised yet, I think we can give up another minute or so. So please chime in if you want or send us a note via the chat. But in the meantime, I think one of the important issues that we have learned an awful lot about over the past couple of years is that when we look at prosecutors and public defenders organizations, they tend to be organized around the county level, and of course every county contains multiple law enforcement agencies. And so the effective and efficient management of all of this new information creates some coordination and management challenges. And again, it may go without saying, but can't say enough about the importance of upfront collaboration and advanced planning for all of this. I think the more that happens, the better off everybody will be. And I want to echo something that Damon said a few minutes ago, that this situation, the emergence of body cameras, presents what looks like a pretty unique opportunity for collaboration across these entities. So that's important. And I would also just stress not only the importance of training for these different entities, but I would also suggest that joint training would be a good idea, not necessarily training the prosecutors separate from public defenders and separate from law enforcement, but getting those people in the same room and going through that training, because I think some unique perspectives and questions would come up from that kind of situation. Also, again, quite obvious, but just looking at Monroe County and San Diego County, we can see that local legislation and guidelines and local culture and local resources, they tend to impact this issue such that there are actually some pretty unique challenges from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and we certainly shouldn't assume that everybody has the same strengths and challenges across the country. There's a lot of important idiosyncratic things going on here. And I think I'm just going to close with an observation. This goes back maybe 10 or 15 years when I was actually involved when the emergence of mandatory taping of homicide interrogations kind of swept the country. And so back then, even before body-worn cameras, hit the field, there was a lot of activity and a lot of concern around audio and videotaping of homicide interrogations. And that actually quickly spread to other types of major crime interrogations, not just homicides. But I think I observed something kind of interesting back then, and I think it's being played out in the same way here. That there was a lot of grousing and arguments from both sides, mostly from law enforcement, about the cost and the burden of this and the intrusion of this on their tactical approaches. But very quickly, I think both sides, in this case, the prosecutors and public defenders, came to realize the great value of these video and audio taped confessions and interrogations. And it didn't take long for that pretty much to be embraced almost system-wide. And I think something similar is happening here. Certainly there are still, resource concerns that we've heard about several times, but I think the value of this evidence is emerging. There was actually an interesting study done in Phoenix a couple years ago under the BJA Policing Innovation Initiative, where they looked at domestic violence cases. It was kind of a quasi-experiment with cases that involved camera footage and cases that didn't. And they found an effect of body cams on conviction rates for DV cases, but they also found an increased burden on the prosecutor's office for reviewing and processing that evidence. So there are certainly some trade-offs to think about here. And I think with that, I will once again thank everyone for participating and joining in, and thank our panelists, and Craig, you and your work in putting this together. Obviously, Samantha, who coordinates all this technologically. So I want to echo my thanks and repeat my thanks for everybody. And we'll sign off for now until the next webinar.